Hey everyone, welcome back to the Anderson Bros Outdoors. I'm Jake, and today we're going to do part one of a mini part series on motor and ESC testing, so stay tuned. Hey everyone, welcome back. As I said, my name is Jake, and today we're going to do the first part of our ESC and motor testing. This first video might be a test run. I've already been testing the engine dyno or the motor dyno to work out any kinks or quirks with it, but as we all know, the first few are trial runs, and then you actually start getting consistent results. This is going to be more of a baseline, potentially, and or fixing any other issues we run into, and we could circle back as we get this process stabilized and moving forward. The key here is to take all of the data that we're getting from these testing and be able to quantify it or put it into some type of understandable visual reference. Everyone out in the community can make a decision on what motor and ESC is best for them. This is not about playing favorites or utilizing products that may or may not work. It's legitimately about getting testing and providing that testing and or results to the community. Now, this is mostly scientific. It's not exact. I don't know that anything is ever exact. We're going to try our hardest to provide exact results each time with each different ESC or motor. What that means is we have numerous sensors to collect data. We have an RPM gauge to collect RPM of the motor. We have temperature gauges to collect the temperature of the ESCs. I don't think that we're going to be able to collect the temperature of the motor easily. We're going to be using the same battery, the same water pump to provide the same amount of pressure to the dyno. Not going to worry about making different pressures or opening and closing valves, things of that nature. We're just going to run a consistent pressure. We really just want results under load, because realistically, when we're doing rock climbing, most of the climbing is going to be light to medium load, but there are going to be instances where you have really heavy trucks or you're doing really crazy obstacles and you're getting the truck stuck or bound up. It's going to cause extra work for the ESC and motor, which turns into heat. The goal is to really test that. The other thing that we're measuring is we're measuring the amperage and the voltage coming out of the battery into the ESC. I have created a spec for the receiver, so we won't actually be using any of the voltage going through the voltage reader for anything but the ESC itself. I've also made a conversion cable for ESCs that have built-in BECs to not use the BEC on the ESC for the receiver and moving forward. Touched on about everything that we've got in terms of measurement. The last thing that we're measuring is we're actually measuring the output of the motor onto a scale. Now, this is probably the most least scientific part of it. While it may work, it may not work, it's not going to provide exact results. So that specific measurement we can take with a grain of salt, at least for right now, until we're able to potentially enhance or figure out a better way to do the dyno. Now, speaking of the dyno, I don't have the user that created this dyno offhand. However, he does have a YouTube channel. I'm linking his channel below, along with his design on Thingiverse. I only modified a few things to use it for myself, but I want to give a huge shout out to that gentleman for creating the dyno and giving it away for free. So feel free to go check out his channel, maybe give him a subscribe, tell him thanks for providing the files for the dyno on Thingiverse. It's much appreciated, saved me a lot of work. With all of that being said, let's go ahead and let's move the camera to the dyno. We'll point out some of the measurement devices, and then we'll go ahead and get started on the testing. Here's the test bench. You see we have a water source. It feeds into the dyno. We do have a pump pumping the water into the input here. And then this hose and this hose on the bottom are outputs. The reason we're pumping in this way is because the motor will be spinning in a counterclockwise rotation. It'll always be fed with a 2S battery, as you can see here, this 5200. And we will keep it charged throughout each different tests. Moving into the dyno, like I said, this is the dyno here. We have a 1450 kV motor on it. We have a RPM magnet with the RPM sensor, which feeds into the RPM gauge here. We have a scale to measure the output of force down on to the scale from the motor turning. We have a receiver. We have the ESC. You can see the red tape here is temporary because I had to solder these temporary leads on there. So feel free to roast me or not, but it is going to prevent any arcing that's occurring. And then the main piece of this puzzle here is we have a volt and amp meter reader. So the source, the battery will be connected here. It'll flow through here directly to the ESC and provide the readouts for the voltage and the current draw from the battery to the ESC. We have a dedicated BEC for the receiver, so we don't have to pull juice from this battery over here for the receiver itself. This will power the RPM gauge and the receiver all on its own. We'll start with a 2S battery, we'll move to a 3S battery, and then a 4S battery. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, jumping into the 2S battery test. As you can see, this is sped up by 4 times to keep everyone from falling asleep on us. We are doing 1-minute runs. We are roughly 600 RPMs to 1000 RPMs. You can see the amp draw, the wattage draw, and then the temperature on the right there. There's not a whole lot else to tell. We are letting it do its thing. We jumped up to 2500 RPM, and you can see on the scale over there that we did increase our ounces in terms of pressure. Moving up to 3700 RPM or so roughly, you can really start to see the temperature exponentially climb here. This would be in an instance where you would have a potential vertical climb that's wet, or you need a lot of wheel speed. As you can see, we're starting at the same 700 RPM range. Nothing really out of the ordinary here. Low amperage, low wattage, very, very slow temperature climb. I did turn the volume off here because the ESC makes the motor whine extremely loudly, and it's rather annoying. You can see that at 2000 RPM, the temperature kind of increases rapidly. Jumping up to 5000 RPM here, you can see that the temperature is rapidly climbing, and we did have an issue where the dyno load device loosened up and we had to stop and retighten it. You can see that the motor did actually stop there, so we concluded that test for heat. This is where it's interesting. We are on full 4S, and the motor started at around 1000 RPM, so we had to dial it back down to 500 RPM, and then as you can see, we're restarting the timer. On these lighter loads, the temperature doesn't really increase significantly. This is where it gets interesting, and when we change it to a little more throttle, so we jump it up to between 5 and 6000 RPM. I know the RPM's all over the place. We did end up having an issue where the motor ended up stopping again, so we just concluded the test. And here we are, back again. We just did the tests. I sped up the video 4 times the speed because nobody really wants to watch it. I also removed the audio because the Micro X2 is extremely loud. when dealing with outriggers. I'm going to have to come back and redo this test. I did order a servo tester so I can really dial in the RPMs for each test, because as you can see, the throttle trim that I was using wasn't very accurate. So this is fantastic for the initial video and to kind of understand what these numbers mean, but just know that at some point in the future, I'll have to come back and redo the testing on it to get the RPM exactly where I want it for each test. Ultimately, I would like to do a 500, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, and 5,000 RPM test for 60 seconds, much like you see in the videos. As we know, motors, and the higher the voltage you go with the outrigger motors, the more revolutions you get out of that motor. I could have a quarter throttle on 2S, and that could be 500 RPM, where it's actually 750 RPM on 3S and 1,000 RPM on 4S. The modulation is a bit different, and it takes a lot to play with, but we will get it dialed in. So some interesting numbers. First of all, looking at the graph here, the RPM is times 100. So you can see where it says 7 there, it's actually 700 RPM, 10 would be 1,000, so on and so forth. The reason I did it was to make the graph look a little more understandable, if you will. If we look at this graph, there's a couple of things that we can note. The blue is RPM, the yellow is amps, and the green is the scale pressure applied at that specific load on that battery voltage. If we take a look at this, you can see on 2S at 700 RPM, we have 4 amps being used, really around a half an amp being used, and we're putting about 0.83 ounces of pressure on the scale. Moving into 3S, you can see that on the same, roughly the same RPM, 650-ish RPM, we're using 0.35 amps, which is 0.05 less than the 2S version. So as we increase voltage, we're actually using less amperage, which is interesting. And we are only putting really 0.56 ounces of pressure on the scale. So it's not working as hard. Moving into 4S at 550 RPM, we're using even less amperage, 0.3, and a little more pressure, or actually we're putting a little less pressure on the scale versus 3S. Maybe. No, I was wrong. We're putting more pressure. The scale, like I said in the beginning of the video, is maybe not as scientific as I'd like it to be. It happens. We'll continue to iron out all of the details. We'll make this work. One of the things that I want to highlight here, this kind of showcases a theme. So the more voltage you have, the less amperage you need, to an extent. Moving to the other end of the spectrum, on 2S we have 5,000 RPM, we're pulling 16 amps, and we're putting a 5.15 ounce load on the scale. Now on 3S at 3,500 RPM, we're pulling 30 amps, and we're putting an 8.32 ounce load on the scale. So I feel like the 2S load may not have been applied accurately or properly, because you can see we should have been pulling probably 40-ish or so amps out of that ESC at 5,000 RPM. One of the things to note, at 3S, the motor did actually stop on 3,500. We didn't actually do the full 60 seconds. The ESC got really hot. It got up to 190 degrees, as you can see in the chart there on the left, and so it actually stops spinning the motor. You can see it in the video as well. And then moving into 4S at 5,500 RPM, we did have the same thing. So the motor ended up stopping at 145 degree temperature. It just quit. I could let off on the throttle, re-engage the throttle, and it would go again, but at that point, that is where I burned up the ESC in the actual truck and caught fire, so I didn't really want to burn up this ESC. One of the other interesting things is that right around the same load type, so 3S was 8.32 ounces, on 4S at 5,500 RPM, we were putting out 8.15 ounces on the scale. So we were almost neck and neck with 3S at 3,500 RPM. The difference, though, is that 3S we were using 30 amps and 4S we're using 19. Now, again, this run is not exactly scientific. It was more along the lines to flush out any issues, potential issues, things of that nature. So we will be redoing this test. This is just to kind of showcase what these tests will look like moving forward. So we're starting out with this 1450 kV motor on the Micro X2, and then we're going to do some other ESCs that I have on the same 1450 motor to get the same output so we can calculate the results much like we have here, and then move into a different motor. So the other motor that I would like to test is a 2450 kV motor. Overall, great first run. Just know that each time I did a run, I waited for the ESC to cool down, and then I also recharged the batteries between each run. I'm not going to dive too much more into detail on what I think until the next video. Feel free to drop a comment below. Let us know what you think in terms of the numbers, and if there's anything that I could potentially do differently or better for the next test. Thanks for watching. If you're not a subscriber, it would be awesome if you subscribe to the channel. And also, if you like the video, throw us a like. Otherwise, we have a huge shout out to the people coming in the next scene. Thanks for all the support, and we hope you have a great day.